We're going to begin now. My name is Ellie Gold. I am the president of the Gold Institute for International Strategy, and we're here today for a second briefing as things continue regarding the assessment of the assassination attempt of President Donald Trump. Over the past 10, 11 days, the news it's constantly moving. Questions are constantly arising. Things are things with every day. There are more questions, and unfortunately, than answers. Yesterday was an interesting day on Capitol Hill. Kimberly Cheadle, who was running the Secret Service, she came to Capitol Hill, and it answered no questions to a degree that everybody, including the Republicans, which we understand, as well as Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and so many others, all called for her resignation, which happened today. That being said, this is an issue that, unlike many others in Washington, just because someone resigns, it does not mean that this issue goes away. Today we'll have three speakers, and then we'll take questions. The first 25 minutes or so, Larry Cunningham, a Gold Institute law enforcement fellow, who worked with the Secret Service and protected six presidents, as well as Pope and many others throughout his tenure, will continue his assessment from last time. Additionally, we have Mark Black, who is a senior law enforcement fellow at the Gold Institute, who spent time in the NYPD in New York, and again engaged closely with the Secret Service during times that protection was needed, and will be followed by Martin Johnson, also a Gold Institute senior law enforcement fellow who worked with the Howard County, Maryland Police Department, and also engaged with the Secret Service when appropriate. And each person here, Larry, Mark, and Martin, all provide a unique perspective on things, and we look forward to at least unpacking this. To be clear, this is not going to. Unfortunately, this isn't the first, and this won't be the last assessment of what's been going on. But ultimately, this is the beginning of how we can address the issues and make recommendations moving forward. So with that, let me turn it over to Larry. Larry, you have about 25 minutes to present your case, and then we'll move on. And then following Martin's remarks, we will open it to questions.
Well, thank you, Ellie, and thank you to the Gold Foundation. I'm honored to be here. I'm pretty passionate about this subject matter, and probably should be. I'm a security consultant currently in my life. However, a significant part of my life involved being assigned to the White House Presidential Protective Division in my career in the Secret Service, my 20-year career in the Secret Service. I'm appalled, candidly, of what I'm learning, reading, and digesting in terms of what occurred in Butler, Pennsylvania, prior to, during, and after the attempt on former President Trump. I'll give you a little more background real quickly. I started my career in 1974, field agent. Then I went to our training academy, and and I was involved in a lot of seminal training initiatives, primarily responses to this type of thing. These things evolve, as you know, and over the years, they've become even more complicated due to the ever-changing technical threat that's posed by the other side, the bad guys. I was involved in a fourth shift concept. Basically, what that meant was the detail agents would be assigned to a fourth shift training about a week at various venues to hone and refine their protective advanced skills, their response skills, and their writing skills. So that particular aspect I'm very familiar with. We also refined physical responses and developed and refined a concept called the attack on the principal exercise. And the field agents were involved in that, but so were police officers and others that came to our academy. Importantly, and specific to this situation, we were involved in formulating a template to train detail agents, candidate detail agents. And basically what that involved was bringing a group of selected agents for protecting the presidential candidate, bringing them to various training venues and teaching them how to work together, learn each other's strengths and weaknesses, basically fostering a good, solid team. We put them through attack on the principal exercises at various venues, various scenarios, and then we would listen to the commo, have hot washes, and then go back and do it again. And this was done up until very recently to make sure that the team that was assigned to a dignitary, a candidate nominee, was as close to the Presidential Protective Division training as we could make it. Since 1994, I've been involved with teaching thousands of police officers and also involved with other countries, their officer corps, their protection corps, and also heads of state, as well as many other corporate protection and security programs. So that's pretty much my background. I'm still ongoing. I still am passionate about this, and I still believe the entire community needs work. But let me give you a little background about where we are with this particular assassination attempt. I'm going to start with advances, and then we'll go into intelligence, the counter sniper response, and then the actual intershift agent response. So starting with the advances, most people have not discussed this in detail yet, but there is actually a very specific statutory authority. It's found in Title 18, United States Code, 3056, Section A, parens 7. And that details and outlines the very specific and unilateral authority of the Secret Service to conduct security advances at any venue when they're doing it on behalf of their particular candidate nominee. This is immutable. This is not up for discussion. This does not allow anybody to abdicate this responsibility to anyone else. So that's cast in stone. It's cast in the law. And I wanted to start with that because there's been a lot of discussion about, well, local police are given the authority to secure a building or secure something on the outer perimeter. Not true. Any threat at all that could impact that dignitary, that protectee, that candidate nominee is the purview and the responsibility of the Secret Service, very well and very detailed in that regard. So I want to put that to rest. In terms of how advanced teams are normally set up, an advanced team for a candidate with the prominence and the notoriety of someone like Trump comes from that detail. Oftentimes it may be supplemented with field agent poststanders and local police. In this case, a site agent from Pittsburgh, a rather new site agent, was actually given the responsibility of doing that particular advance in Butler. That normally should not happen. It should come from the actual detail for obvious reasons. That detail agent knows some of the specific needs, and they vary from detail to detail, from personality to personality, and from environment to environment, city to city. So for continuity's sake, an advanced team is normally sent out from that detail. In this case, it was not. It was a relatively new agent from Pittsburgh charged with the responsibility of setting that site up and having the site responsibilities. Next, the shift, the actual bodyguards, if you will, are always assigned from that particular candidate detail. And as in this case with former President Trump, it was. Now, other components that go with this, and again, as outlined in that statutory authority and as outlined in operational manuals, I'm very familiar with them. I used to write them and I invoke these all the time. Ellie explained to you that I've been involved with 6 presidents and 2 after my retirement. I'm very familiar with how these things work. I've done at least 50 advances, about half lead advances where I utilize all the components I'm going to talk about. Let's talk about those components. Well, there's a transportation agent, a person that does the transportation, does the routes, primary, secondary, tertiary. There's folks that review the hospital, look at the site. There's a counter assault team that actually accompanies the transportation agent to look at the route. They look at vulnerabilities. Their job in life is to address any threat that may present itself in the motorcade or during the travel from the airport, for example, to the rally. Their job in life is to address that aggressively, neutralize it if necessary, to allow the motorcade to move on. Now, there's also, and there's been a lot of talk about this, counter sniper team. I'm going to get involved in that in a minute. I'll explain how that works. Importantly, there's also normally an intelligence roving team. And the concept there is for an agent from the shift or from a field office or from an intelligence division to perform as an intelligence agent, usually hooked up with a local police counterpart that also has interest and experience with intelligence, meaning how do they address threats? What are the threats? They normally have a roving team role, which means if there's an issue, for example, that we had in Butler, a suspicious person hanging around the magnetometer with rangefinder equipment, that is something that would be very specific and the responsibility of the intelligence roving team. There's also something that I do not believe, based on my sources, was present at this advance, a concept called the counter surveillance unit. That was not present at this site from everything we can determine. Now, these things are coming not just from me and not just from my observation and not just from reviewing the trove of media coverage. This also comes, interestingly, from the basic whistleblowers that we're hearing from. So this has credibility. Also, it's coming from members of Congress that have been briefed in closed door sessions. This has a significant amount of credibility. Basically, having said that and having given you that background, it's been determined, and it's being investigated now, that the Trump team, the Trump advance team, and the Trump manpower allocation was minimal. Only 3, possibly only 1 post-stander from the detail was assigned. Contrast that with the First Lady detail in Pittsburgh received 12 post-standers. Temporary agents were also assigned from candidate nominee operations section. And basically what that is it's a group that identifies agents from the field to supplement security. Oftentimes it includes Homeland Security agents. In this case, there were a significant number of those. Bottom line here, this is not the A team, the A security team. Also, given what we're learning, the resources that were allocated for this were less than optimum. In fact, they were less than a normal protectee with this type of notoriety and this type of threat level would be given. Now, it's important to mention this because initially the spokesperson for the Secret Service said that in view of significant threats to include an Iranian assassination plot. They said that actually security resources and security was beefed up. Simply not true. It was verified and proven, and then the spokesperson from the Secret Service had to come back and basically apologize more or less and say, well, we have different levels of resources for different protectees. Translation, they weren't given commensurate resources to match the threat. So basically, that is an issue that compounded the problem there in Butler. It's been determined through my sources, media sources, and others that Trump has a ongoing disproportionate threat level, and he's had that for years. It's probably not a shock to anybody. That has become heightened in the last year or two, and the folks familiar with the detail and familiar with doing advances for the Trump team have basically complained they haven't been getting commensurate resources, and that has been established now, and that's being reviewed and investigated. So to say that this detail was staffed and resourced normally is just simply not true. Now, more recently, based on the Senator Grassley review and letters he's written to the Secret Service and CNN and whistleblower reports, they basically have said that not only were fewer resources provided for the Trump detail in the last 2 years, but also there's a significant tension that's been reported by the management and leaders of the Trump detail, which is very disturbing. So I'm giving you this background based on everything I've learned to try to paint the picture that might contextualize what happened here a little more carefully and a little more thoroughly. Again, the spokesperson from the Secret Service sort of conceded this recently. Now, I'm getting to the nitty-gritty here, but I want to talk about something vitally important, and that's communications. Communications are always important, and under stress, folks don't always communicate that well. Some of the things that were omitted, frankly, conspicuously absent from a normal security advance was there was no police meeting prior to the visit in Butler. The U.S. Secret Service has encrypted comms, and the police agencies are represented and were represented in the command post. But I've just listened literally 10 minutes ago to the Colonel of State Police assigned to that area in Butler saying the interoperable comms is an ongoing issue and that it was cumbersome, to say the least, when these issues were reported to the command post. Command post, for those that may want some clarification, there was one set up there in Butler, and normally the Secret Service runs that. They have the responsibility for that. And a representative from state police, Butler PD, sheriff's office, and other emergency responders are present in that command post. The idea is, in case there's a communication lapse or misunderstanding or clarification needed from something very important, like a suspicious person at the magnetometer or a suspicious person climbing a roof, those things are relayed immediately, theoretically, to the command post. Decisions are made and deployments are made. Now, the counter sniper. Counter snipers operate with the advance. They're a vital part of the advance team. I can tell you that they do a separate advance, and they're very professional in my area. I've reviewed probably no less than 20 or 30 of their particular surveys, not only as an active agent, but also recently when I was supplementing and assisting various government agencies with security. They do a very thorough, at least in my era, a very thorough review of distance, windage, vantage points, and so forth. A question just come up. Why in the world did the counter sniper team, with warning, not see this particular person on the roof at the AGR building? It's still a question still being reviewed. But I can tell you, based on their equipment, which is worth 20, tens of thousands of dollars, they should have been able to surveil that, particularly when someone pointed it out to them. There's some discussion about why or why not they didn't see it immediately. I'm in communication with a very high-level firearms and scope expert, and they tell me, based on the review of the pictures, that these particular counter sniper folks did a couple things that may have caused a delay. And I say may, it's being reviewed. But number one, they had scopes that were significantly overpowered for the area they were surveilling. Certainly it's good to have these types of scopes, but their scopes and their other finder equipment was way overpowered for a 200-yard or 130-yard threat. So basically, as it was described to me, it would be like trying to read a book with binoculars. They had to review, if you look at the picture, they had to review the area and then go back down to their particular scope and their equipment and then make the decision. That may account right now for some of the delay. The other accounting for the delay is delayed communication between the command post and the counter sniper team and other entities. So what we're doing right now is we're trying to look at how in the world could this happen. In my view, there are lots of opportunities at the advanced level to really identify any types of issues, or at least set up components that would be better at proactively recognizing a potential threat. That was weak. They did not have the normal components to do a credible job of that. Also, they did not have they had type of a sort of a restrictive perimeter, security perimeter. And the thinking was, and the statements that came from various folks in authority, to include the former director, is that while that was out of the secure zone, the AGR building, for example, that was the responsibility of the police. I'll say it again, you cannot abdicate that responsibility. I will also say, for purposes of clarifying what a threat would be and what level of responsibility it might be from a distance perspective, there's such a thing called Huntsman. It's a helicopter that precedes the motorcade, in some cases 2 miles ahead, mile each side, half a mile. And then it also goes to the site to review and assess any issues that may occur. Also, there normally is a drone. This was not assigned. Also, it's important to know that if intelligence or information received about a threat coming from Pittsburgh, for example, or another site, or the airport, or a site or a place 10 miles away, just because it's far away doesn't abdicate the responsibility to address that threat aggressively. So the things you're hearing about, well, it's on the outer perimeter, it's really not our responsibility. We delegated that to the local police, the sheriff, or the county counter sniper. Impossible. That is not correct. It's not policy, and it's simply wrong. Lastly, I want to talk a little bit about the inner perimeter and the detail agent response to the protectee. I go back to communications. There's a lot of questions about what kinds of communications were given to the detail leader, shift leader that were protecting, in close protection of former President Trump. There seems to be a question about what was communicated, what wasn't. It appears that urgency about a man on a roof with a gun or someone climbing a building within 150 yards of the site should have been communicated with a high sense of urgency. It's been determined now that as long as 20 minutes earlier, this suspicious person was seen, reported by the state police, rangefinders, and suspicious behavior. And police develop instincts. They know what suspicious behavior is. Any law enforcement officers or security folks listening to me right now understand what that is. That was communicated to the command post. It obviously was not communicated to the shift or the counter sniper team. We're going to find out more about that. But let's get back to what we do know. So with about a minute, 2 minutes at the most, this information was being communicated with a sense of urgency, man with a gun. And it was initially noted by a spectator, which I find impossible to believe, but apparently that was the way it went down, which makes me very concerned about the response and the sense of urgency and the training. At any rate, that was reported with very, very little time for the counter snipers to hone in on it and address it. But the question is, why in the world, when they had this threat, didn't the shift immediately remove former President Trump to a safe area? Why in the world? We'll find out more later. But there was 1 minute and 26 seconds from the time the first shot was fired and the protectee was moved. I would go back to my experience and the examples that I'm familiar with and those that mentored me was that 20 minutes earlier, you had a very suspicious threat. And there were many threats in that time frame between the first report of a suspicious person at the magnetometer all the way up to the report of an urgent, imminent, dangerous threat, man with a gun. It would have been very simple for the detail leader or shift leader to say, Mr. Trump, we're going to stay in the limo. We're going to stay in a holding room until this is resolved. That wasn't done. And that is something that I find candidly egregious. Now, last point, training. You noted with that response when the attack occurred, when the first shots occurred, you'll note that the detail shift, the inner shift, those assigned to former President Trump covered him well, and they moved him with some delay, but they moved him out of the area. You'll also remember that there seemed to be quite a few agents scattered about the limousine and in front of the dais there that didn't really seem to know what they're doing. And if that's your sense, you're right. It's obvious to me, having been intimately involved in the training of these folks, that they simply had not done any attack on the principal exercises. But remember, go back now, the allocation of detail agents was apparently, by some reports, 3, possible only 1. And then you have the shift, which was assigned to Trump. So what you have now is you have an inner perimeter bodyguard shift being protected by folks that really don't understand the SOPs of a high-level dignitary with the knowledge of attacking the principal, how to deploy, how to move, how to cover and evacuate, essentially how to alert, cover, and evacuate. They seemed unsure. This, to me, is a result of allocating not only less resources, but less quality folks. In other words, the third team as opposed to the first team. Probably well-intentioned, but simply not trained, particularly with a dangerous, imminent, lethal threat, which actually became a lethal threat. So these kinds of things are going to be reviewed. It's multifactored. There's other things that I'll be happy to address with questions, but that's the sum and substance of it. So basically, it was a very poor advance. The powers to be ignored the statute, which authorizes commensurate resources and manpower to address and properly conduct a security advance. They basically did not utilize most of the components that would be normal for this type of threat, particularly this type of protectee, particularly with the kinds of threats that he has been experiencing, not just now, but over the years. Communications is huge. That was not done in proper fashion, not nearly proactive enough. So this is a very, very disturbing thing. The thoughts that there may be some bias or implicit bias with the allocation of resources is very disturbing to me, and hopefully that'll be addressed as well. Communication speaks for itself. That's always difficult, but the type of interoperability that could have been resolved with a police meeting presented itself as a problem. And I believe that chilled and delayed immediate response to evacuate the protectee. Last thing. In September 2014, you recall that an individual jumped over the fence at the White House South grounds, made his way all up into an unlocked front door. A Secret Service person allowed that person in, and then that person was arrested finally by an off-duty agent. At that moment, there was and is a assigned counter sniper team on the roof of the White House. What happened there is egregious. The fact that someone could make it that far up. As a result, Jason Chaffetz and others formed a committee to look at and review Secret Service culture, responses, and training. And they believed that at that time that there were 16, actually 19 elements that the Secret Service had to work on. They've only addressed about 6. And the reports I read a couple of years ago said they were doing an admirable job. The reality is the proof is in the pudding. And they may have written it down. They may have written a nice report or invited congressmen out to the training site. But the reality is they have not fulfilled those mandates that they agreed to as many as 10 years ago. All right. Thank you, Ellie.
Thank you, Larry. We're going to move on. I know people have questions, and I have some questions as well, but we're going to save all the questions for later. Let's move on to Mark Black, the Gold Institute Senior Law Enforcement Fellow. Mark spent 20 plus years at the NYPD in various different aspects of the department, including collaboration with the Secret Service during protective operations in New York City. Mark, the floor is yours. Don't forget to unmute yourself. You have to unmute, Mark, you have to unmute yourself.
Thank you very much, everyone, for being here. And Larry, thank you very much for that very in-depth analysis. My name is Mark Black, spent 20 years with the New York City Police Department. Was involved with a lot of dignitary protection operations and part of what we call the packages as well. And there's something very, very important that I want to touch upon. As big as NYPD is, it's still a local police department. And Larry had mentioned many, many times communications. And when we look at what just happened in this particular incident, we can break down where there's the 2 elements of failure: communications and vocational knowledge. And I want to go back to the communications. We have to ask ourselves, when we're dealing with these protection details, when does the communication start? For local law enforcement, it's going to start with a telephone call and from the federal agency, Secret Service in this case, and that's where it all begins. Everyone thinks the communications is only happening at the location of the day of the event. That site survey begins the assessment process. And at NYPD, in our intelligence division, we had a whole unit that was dignitary protection. So once notification is made, individuals would go out into the field and conduct an assessment of the location, venue, and start speaking to other units within the department, such as highway, to look at route analysis. By the time that Secret Service, in this case, let's say, would come in, they're going to do their own assessment and site survey that Larry was talking about. Then, as a group, the local law enforcement, NYPD, with all the different units that are going to be involved, are going to meet with Secret Service, and we're going to basically discuss our findings on the site survey and also what is happening in the environment. This is very, very important. When Secret Service or any federal agency, even if it's Diplomatic Security Service, DSS, working for the State Department with all their dignitary protection as well, comes into an area, and we'll use New York, they rely heavily on local law enforcement because local law enforcement is working in that environment every single day. not only are they looking at the threats of what's happening, but they're looking, what is the environmental rhythm that's happening? For instance, is there going to be construction that's going to be happening in the area? Is there a hospital that's going to be down for renovation and taking away maybe some beds in the ER? And that might have been Secret Service who wanted to use that hospital as a primary. We have to move it. So we have to have this communication, and it all begins with the site survey, which is extremely, extremely important. The other thing is that when the local law enforcement, and Larry had mentioned this also, is it's training. When local law enforcement, such as myself, was embedded with the packages, our assignment to work with our counterpart, whether it's Secret Service or whatever federal counterpart we're working in that protective detail, is really to, our job was, is there any changes in the environment that we need, that happened on a local level, that we need to pass on to Secret Service so they can make notifications or adjustments for that day's itinerary. So as you can see, communications is such an important part of the dignitary protection process. Now, the other thing is the vocational training aspect of this as well. On our level in NYPD, when I was there, we went through dignitary protection training, not on the level that Larry coming from Secret Service did. But why did we do that? Why did we have this training? Well, one is to assimilate ourselves into what are the norms, psychologically assimilate ourselves. What are the norms that a Secret Service agent in a shift is doing, just to have a basic understanding of their job, so it's not foreign to us. And also, more importantly, is to understand different lingo, to understand what is being said. Every vocation has a vocabulary. This is so important for communications. So that everyone had to go through training. Now, the next thing I want to talk about, which Larry brought up, which is very, very important from the tactical level, is the command post. All right. In NYPD, I know we're an anomaly and we're not a rural police department and we're not even a suburbia, we're just have a lot of resources. There is redundancy for communications going back to a command post. So in the command post, we would have Secret Service, we would have intelligence, we might have a highway person, we have any other federal agencies that were involved. And then on the street, we have the communications that are broken down even more to maybe people that are handling specific sections of that location where this primary is going to be. So at a moment's notice, if anything, there's an anomaly within the environment, there is a rapid dissemination of information. And then from the command post, it can be disseminated to those individuals on the ground who can interdict and start the investigation of what's really going on. So when I look at this incident, it goes back to, when was that first site survey being conducted? And I would really like to know, while that was being conducted, what was local law enforcement's input into the site survey, and how was that communication going on? One other thing that to me, the former Secret Service director who just retired, to say that that was local law enforcement's responsibility and accountability, can open up a Pandora's box of trust between federal agencies working with local law enforcement. Everybody has responsibility and accountability. But going forward, you don't want to have a bad taste in anybody's mouth. We all have to work together as a team. And when people take a cheap shot at that and run away from their responsibilities, it will have it may have a significant effect on the interoperability of how local law enforcement then works with our federal partners and vice versa. So we had great communications when I was with NYPD. Matter of fact, you develop interpersonal relationships with agents who will call you up, even on your cell phone, and say, listen, we're coming into the city. That's what you want. You want to develop very strong interpersonal relationships and work as a complete team locally with the feds and then back with the feds to the locals. I think that what Larry has mentioned is right on point. Communications is where a detail will become very successful. And I thank everybody.
Ellie, you're muted.
Thank you, Martin, for keeping on top of me for there. I want to introduce Martin Johnson. Martin has spent his career with the Howard County Police Department. Howard County is clearly larger than the Butler PD, but certainly provides perspective. Martin is a Gold Institute Senior Law Enforcement Fellow, has been with us for the past 5 years. And Martin, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ellie, for putting this together. Thank you, Mark and Larry, for being so comprehensive. So the blessing for your being so comprehensive is that I'll be shorter because you've covered a lot that I was going to say, and we'll have more time for questions. So, excuse me, a couple of main points. Who the protectee is and why that person needs protection is the number one consideration for the allotment of resources. Who is more hated on planet Earth than Donald John Trump? The guy, it is not a stretch to think that somebody might take a shot at the guy. Is somebody going to take a shot at somebody else? Maybe not as much as far as likelihood goes. So anyway, when Larry and Mark talk about the allocation of resources, there is no reason in the world why the Trump team shouldn't get whatever they want. They should be the A team. They should get whatever they want, whatever they need. They know best. They are the bakers. Don't come in and tell the baker how to bake. They're the bakers. They'll tell you what they need. Pardon me. Second, presume the worst. I've been on details with the Secret Service. I was on with the First Lady's detail, Mrs. Barbara Bush, charming lady. Excuse me. And when I worked with Secret Service, I was the local liaison. So whatever the Secret Service needed, they got it. I made sure of it. And that's what my police chief wanted, and that's what we do, and that's just the way it goes. But we have to presume the worst. Prepare for war, and if it doesn't happen, great. Prepare for an attack. If it doesn't happen, great. Seeing a guy with a rangefinder, that's a little outside of baseline behavior. That's something that should have been paid a whole hell of a lot of attention to. Excuse me. So, I've heard, I don't know, I wasn't there, but I've heard that on some people's audio, one of the agents was heard to be saying, "What are we doing? What are we doing?" There's no reason you should be asking that question. You should know exactly what you're doing. There's a protocol. You've trained for it. You should not have to ask, "What are we doing?" Was it true? I don't know. But if it was, that certainly erodes my confidence. Pardon me. I would like to see, when I left my police department, it was 25 years doing law enforcement and 15 so far teaching it. when I left, I went, my last day as an officer brought in my first day in internal affairs. And in internal affairs in my police department, we take a look at events, officers' actions, and we try to determine with a neutral outlook. We want to just find facts. So how does that apply here? I would love to see an NTSB, National Transportation Safety Board, and I'd love to see an NTSB style evaluation of everything. Give whatever the organization is, excuse me, give whatever organization it is, whatever people are drafted to do this, give them whatever they want and let them find it. They should have something to do with the business. I don't necessarily want my friends, the plumbers, doing this, but I'd want somebody who's in the business. NTSB style investigation, because NTSB goes after facts, period. That's all they care about. And they don't leave it to United Airlines if that's what happened. They don't leave it to Southwest. Can Southwest be part of it? Yes, but NTSB type of investigation is what I'd love to see. Larry, real quick, Larry, if I heard you incorrectly, apologies. I think you said that there was no local comprehensive meeting with the police.
That is correct. I've researched that twice, and I heard it at testimony.
Yeah, unforgivable. They have eyeballs, they have bodies, they have firearms and the ability to defend. They're as important as anybody else. To not have a meeting with your local police is unforgivable. And finally, I'm sorry. Also, I mentioned eroding some public confidence. Director Cheadle, I think, was backed into a corner, as she should have been. But what happens when anybody gets backed into a corner? You get your flight or fight instinct takes over. So she fought, and now she flew. So, zero confidence there. And the things that I heard, I couldn't believe. I would never allow those things to come out of my mouth were I in that chair. So thank you, Ellie. I try to make it as quick as I can so we have a conference.
Thank you, Martin. So if anyone has any questions, they should raise their virtual hand or message me on the in the chat here, and I will call upon you. But I do want to touch on a couple things. Number one is, I'm going to ask, I know that Larry, Mark, and Martin will all have comments to make. So I'm going to, I ask that each one of you should keep your responses as limited as possible, but yet still answering the question. The question, of course, that we have is I have two really. We'll merge them into one, and that is the budget. We talk about the budget of the Secret Service. This was discussed at the hearing. This is discussed many times. I know John touched on this as well, and that is you have 9,600 Secret Service agents. This is clearly a budgetary issue, and therefore there wasn't enough personnel. But aside from that, that's one aspect of it which I would love for you to touch on. The second thing is training. Okay, and the three of you train law enforcement. You travel the country training law enforcement. To suggest that training is a problem, where did we go wrong? And what aspect? Clearly, I know that you guys don't train on these aspects. Otherwise, they would have known what to do. But the question, of course, becomes: is it a budgetary issue? Is it training? What was the dynamic in this case that these people lacked training? Larry, let's start with you.
Okay, you're hitting something that has been discussed based on that panel as a result of that fence jumper in 2014. That's raising its head again here 10 years later. And the reality is, on paper, they had a great plan. The suggestion of that committee Chaffetz committee and others. And I thought it was very astute the way they looked at it. They looked at it in a multifactored fashion. I reread it last few days. I can tell you they talked about details, particularly presidential and vice presidential, in lieu of poor responses, et cetera, to basically do about 25% of their work, their life and work in training. That seemed a bit unrealistic at the time. And they basically pared that back to about 12, 14%. Now, the reality is, and again, I keep in touch with some former directors and other folks that do these kinds of things. The reality is they currently have 35 or 36 protectees, the Secret Service does. They have 8,000 employees and they have a significant fewer doing protection, particularly those that are really practiced and expert at it. Well, if you spread that out to 35 or 36 protectees, there simply isn't time to do PT. And I'll make sort of a note here. I really pride myself in trying to be fair as much as I possibly can. And of course, I have bias too. But I think that is a key factor. It's not an excuse, but it's a key factor in terms of explaining why in the world some of these folks that are involved in the front line with very high level protectees have not been able to respond maybe the way they should. So that is a factor. Of course, my French teacher, as I mentioned last one, she would tell me, you didn't do it right, you don't have your homework. C'est pas d'excuse. It's not an excuse, it's a reason. And if I may, please, I have one point here I'd like to mention. We can talk about it in detail later. But what we've lost here, and I don't know if it's anesthesia because of our wonderful technology. I have many examples and theories about that. But what happened to creativity? What happened to resourcefulness? I'm not a counter sniper, but I've shot every weapon. I've been in lots of attack situations in training. And actually in a few others. But anyway, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, well, they have this building 100, I believe it's 48 yards away now. And the commentary was, well, that view from the counter sniper was hidden by a branch. Okay. There was also a water tower that would have served as a great vantage point. Why it wasn't used, I don't know. But here's an idea. Okay, let's assume you do not have the manpower and you simply can't post it, which I don't believe. Apparently, there's a report that someone who was assigned to that did not show. That's going to come out later. But let's assume we have nobody and we got to deal with that vulnerability. Okay, well, what happened to tarps? What happened to maybe putting the Teletron in the way? Or, candidly, one of those posters that Trump was looking at? And why don't you look at it from the perspective of a potential shooter and also the perspective of a counter sniper? That's pretty cheap. I can go out to Home Depot and get a 24/7 prop company and say, look, I want this covered. Give you history here real quick. When President Reagan was shot at in 1981 at the Capitol Hilton, at that time, they changed a couple things. Operationally, they made sure that the press would not be a public access area. It would be private. It would be cordoned off to only authorized press that had been checked for weapons and that type of thing. They invoked the 500-foot rule, which meant public could not be any closer than 500 feet. They also invoked, and I did an advance there for the prayer breakfast for the president. I've done many others over the years, but they put tarps hanging from the back of the hotel at the employee and delivery entrance. So they drove the vehicle in under that tarp and basically hid him from view of a potential assassin. There's really a lot of things can be done. So I'm thinking we're losing a little of our creativity. It's not a 100% solution. It's not a permanent operational solution. But in the back of your mind, you have to have that creativity and that resourcefulness running in your mind. I don't see that in this current crop of protectors.
Martin?
Honestly, I think Larry just covered it. I have nothing to add. Thanks.
Mark?
The question with training also comes, and which I would like to know, probably Larry knows the question to this, is how many other agencies, non-secret service, that were on the plainclothes detail of that event? Because Larry brings up a good point with the training, is that you want it to be on the same level, because the training also comes back to communication once again, which is very, very significant here. And going forward, if the agency is going to stay at the numbers they are, and they want to what we call fly in other agents from other law enforcement departments, then that training has to be on the same par. Training is just not the physical, let me see my gun, let's learn tactics. Training, there's a psychological aspect to this. There is intercommunications. There's a lot of dynamics that go into this. So if they're going to keep the resources the same for Secret Service, and they want to fly in other agents from outside agencies, what is their training going to look like or be?
Okay. So we have two questions, and then we are going to and then we'll sign off for today. Susan Martin posted a question, and I'm just going to get to the bottom line, and that is, what is in the short term? What are the recommendations that you have for the immediate future in protecting Trump or anyone else? Mark, why don't we go with you? We'll start with you.
Yeah, so this is a very important. So immediately, let's do lessons learned and takeaways. That's the way we look at it in our field. We call it lessons learned. Right now, from the level, we know that there needs to be better communication. That's by far. There has to be better communication. Once that side agent shows up to that area, it doesn't make a difference if it's a rural area, a suburb, or a city like New York. The interpersonal relationships have to be established. Whether it's going to be on the fly or not, they need to be established. They need to start to work as a team. There's no team. There's no, oh, this is responsibility, accountability. Everybody has it. We're all in this together. All right. So that's the first thing. Long haul, you talk about a psychological impact. I brought this up, and this is so, and Larry and I discussed this as well. You cannot, from a local law enforcement perspective, if we're all working as a team and we have that good communications, you have reduced the probability of an incident. But once the finger pointing starts, and you say, well, that's responsible of just local law enforcement, that's going to open up a Pandora's box of a non-trust environment. And we do not want that at all. Will this increase the probability of attacks? Look, we have a saying. It's not will it, it's when. We always are thinking when and how. And all three of us look at attacks from the bad guy's perspective. And bad guys are like water. They want the path of least resistance. So whether it's Trump, whether it's somebody at the State Department, whether it's an individual, the mayor's office, it makes no difference. If there is a breach in a security protocol, policy, program, or procedure, the bad guy's going to take advantage of that. So
right.
Go ahead, Larry.
Well, I'll let you finish, then I have a couple of remarks. But
Go ahead, Larry. I'm good.
okay. So Mark's point on, in fact, Martin, absolutely. I pride myself in being in a group like this, because it's not just my perspective. We're a team, and this is an example of it right here in front of us. We have me from the federal side, we got Mark, and we've got Martin, and we all have parallel perspectives, but we come from a different context. And no one of us is as smart as all of us. And I think collectively, this type of interaction enhances and makes us better at what we do. Speaking of that, we talked about what can we do immediately and what can we do long term. Well, candidly, I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel right now. All I think we need to do is go back to what's on paper and what has been neglected. For example, let's do some more attack and the principle exercises. If we identify a team, make the time, prioritize it, and go to the training site, Beltsville, Quantico, whatever it is, and let's train to these things. We had a pretty progressive agent in charge, and we did on-site extractions at the ranch for President Reagan, or in certain areas at Bowling Air Base, and we used mannequins and put it in the helicopter and gave CPR and created scenarios where we had to demonstrate our first aid capability. It has to be second nature. So I don't think we have to reinvent the wheel yet. We certainly have to keep pace with new technology, but darn it, we've got to just do what we're supposed to be doing to begin with. I want to pick up real quickly on something Mark said, which is
Very, very quickly.
incredibly important. This business now of the service abdicating or trying to abdicate this responsibility to locals has me very, very worried. We are a team, and if you are not trusted and you're going into New York, Des Moines, Dayton, Ohio, wherever it is, and you are saying we need this and this and this, that's going to chill the relationship and it's going to create a little bit of mistrust. That really is a devastating problem if you're trying to create a team to secure people. One other thing, in the interview with Waters, Jesse Waters recently with the president and JD Vance, former president and JD Vance, you'll see that Trump said he wasn't aware of this. He said, "Why didn't they keep me somewhere? I didn't know anything about this." Wow, that's rapport with a principal. And if you keep this kind of stuff from your wife or your best friend or your comrade in the battlefield or a protectee, wow, you are going to make things worse for everybody. So I'd say in the short run, let's go back to the drawing board. What can we realistically do with the training that's already on the books, and then what we can do short-term, long-term, and enhance this? Because some of the things that have happened, from my perspective and others, could have been solved or could have been avoided or at least mitigated if we'd done what we were supposed to do in the first place.
In 30 seconds or less from each of you, the question we have legislators on in this meeting and their staff. Questions that need to be asked in the days forward as this investigation continues. Martin?
Mercilessly, anybody should be asking, how did this happen? Don't be sensitive, just be merciless. Find out. This is one of the most important things that could have changed world history, and has to a lesser extent than it had shot been fatal. Now, and for just real quick for Larry and Mark's training, excuse me, I'm putting everybody on the same page. Everybody responsible for security at any event like this needs to think like we do with death investigations. You find a dead body, it's a murder until you figure out that it's not. So you see a guy with a range fire, he's an assassin until you figure out that he's not.
Excellent. Mark, questions that need to be asked.
Yeah, from doing a lot of security and vulnerability assessments, and what I'd like to know is what was the interaction when that agent first came to Butler to do the site survey with the local law enforcement? What is that interaction? What was being said? What was being done? And what was how did they proceed to do it? And what was local law enforcement told and not told to do? Because that's going to be documented. There is MOUs, memorandums of understanding as well, in this whole thing. What was everybody's responsibility and accountability coming out of that assessment?
Thank you. Larry, 30 seconds or less. What
First
questions
of all,
need to be asked?
First of all, I sincerely appreciate members and their staff that are watching to take such an interest. I'm very passionate about this, and this is what I do for my life. So having said that, having seen training from its infancy when we formulated new programs and going up to where we are today, I would simply offer that we have to look at how can we prioritize time, money, and resources to look at the obvious gaps and vulnerabilities that we saw. We can't throw money at everything. We have to prioritize it. But I am really big, like Mark and Martin are, about let's address the areas that we where they clearly dropped the ball on, and let's make it a priority and accountable, not just write it on a mandate, but let's make them accountable to actually do and implement training and dollars to shore up the hemorrhaging. Well, let's look at the hemorrhaging first. We can talk about the venous bleed later, but that's so very important. I would also offer, with all due respect, I know everyone's busy, but if a couple of members of these groups from Congress maybe could go out and view an advance on how it's put together, maybe sit in on a police meeting, and then maybe watch an arrival and a departure. That would be huge, because they could speak very intelligently to this. Lastly, in my era, it was a long time ago, but it's still true now after what I'm seeing, is that we had a big initiative called the Protective Operation Briefing. And when I was in our training academy, we went out to police departments all over the country. And simply we went over assassination studies, mistakes, and good things. And then we gave them scenarios. They worked with us so we could all be on the same page. Similar terminology, and learn to appreciate what their resources are so we can work as a team, as opposed to coming and say, this is how it's going to go, folks. And, we're the feds, and this is what you need. That's never going to work. We have to be a team. Put the ego at the door, and let's try to make this better.
Thank you, Larry, Mark, and Martin for today. And I know we're going to have further briefings as well on this very important topic. I want to thank everybody for joining us. And if you haven't done so already, take a look at our website, goldiis.org. Review, see who we are, see who our fellows are, see the articles and work that we do, and of course, feel free to support the Institute and the fellows at the Institute. Thank you very much for joining us today.